My grandmother left me her house, but one room wasn't mine to open. I'm still sitting in my car outside a lawyer's office trying to figure out how to type this out without it sounding insane, so bear with me if it's messy. My grandmother Margaret died 3 weeks ago. She was 82, she'd been sick for a while, and honestly the family had made peace with it the way you do when someone's decline has been slow enough to watch happen in real time. What none of us made peace with was the will. Everyone in that room, including me, assumed the house was going to my Uncle Richard. He's her son. He's 57. He'd been telling people for years, in that casual way where you can tell it's not casual at all, that he'd probably end up dealing with the house when the time came. So when the lawyer, a tired-looking man named Mr. Okafor who kept adjusting his glasses like they were bothering him, said the property goes to Evelyn, the room went quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. My mother's hand actually stopped moving on her coffee cup. Richard didn't say anything for a solid 10 seconds, which if you knew Richard is basically a scream. Then Mr. Okafor kept reading. There was a line in the will I still can't get out of my head. It said everything in the house belonged to me, all of it except the contents of one room. The blue room upstairs at the end of the hall. It was to remain locked. Margaret had written in her own handwriting apparently that the room and its contents were not to be opened, sold, or disclosed, and that if I violated this condition the house would revert to a trust controlled by Richard. No explanation. No reasoning, just a locked door and a very specific, very legal threat. I want to be upfront that I'm not a person who goes looking for drama. I'm 29, I do freelance graphic design, I have a cat, I pay my bills on time, and until 3 weeks ago the most mysterious thing in my life was why my downstairs neighbour's washing machine ran at 2 a.m, but I loved my grandmother. She was strict and private and said things like, I don't owe anyone an explanation for my own house, but she also used to call me every Sunday just to ask what I'd eaten that week, and she remembered things about me that even my mother forgot, like which of my ex-boyfriends had a lisp, and which one had a dog he liked more than me. She was sharp. She kept everything, photographs, letters, ticket stubs, newspaper clippings, in labelled boxes in the attic like she was building an archive of a life she expected someone to eventually go looking through. So when she leaves me a house with a locked room and a legal clause basically daring me not to open it, I don't think, oh, that's just Grandma being eccentric. I think she wanted me to find something. She just needed enough time to pass or enough distance from Richard before I did. I moved in about a week after the funeral. The house is out past the edge of town, the kind of property where your nearest neighbour is visible but not close, surrounded by overgrown hedges Margaret used to trim herself until her knees gave out. It's a lot of house for one person. Creaky floors, a garden gone half wild, a garage full of tools nobody's touched in a decade, a basement that smells like a basement. The furniture is old but not in a sad way, it's the kind of old where you can tell someone chose it on purpose 40 years ago and then just never saw a reason to replace it. There are photographs everywhere. Margaret on a boat sometime in the 70s. Margaret at what I assume is a work event, unsmiling, arms crossed. Richard as a kid missing a front tooth. My mother as a teenager with big hair, looking embarrassed to be photographed. The first few days were mostly logistics, which I think surprised me more than anything else. You'd think inheriting a house with a legally mandated forbidden room would come with some kind of cinematic dread hanging over the place. But mostly it came with a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink, and a landline that still worked and kept ringing with people trying to sell Margaret extended warranties on a car she didn't own anymore. I spent one whole afternoon just figuring out which breaker controlled which room, because the labels inside the panel had worn off decades ago, and Margaret apparently just knew them all by memory. I found a drawer in the hallway console entirely full of rubber bands, which felt like the kind of detail that shouldn't have made me cry, and did anyway. I called a locksmith about the garage door, not the blue room, because at that point I hadn't even registered the second lock as strange yet. It just looked old, and old locks aren't automatically sinister, they're just old. I kept working too, because freelance design doesn't pause for grief or inheritance drama, and honestly I think it helped. I had a client who wanted a rebrand for a small chain of coffee shops, and there's something almost soothing about sitting at a borrowed kitchen table, adjusting kerning on a logo while upstairs, an entire locked chapter of your family's history sits behind a door you haven't worked up the nerve to look at directly yet. I'd catch myself glancing up the stairs sometimes while I worked, the way you glance at a phone you're expecting a text on, and then go back to my layout like nothing had happened. My cousin Ben, Richard's son, stopped by once during that first week too, mostly to help me move a couch nobody else wanted to lift, He's 26, works in it, and has always been the one person in that side of the family who treats gossip like it's beneath him, which I've always appreciated. When I mentioned the Will's condition about the blue room, half joking, he actually laughed. Grandma had a locked room the whole time and none of us knew. That's kind of iconic, honestly. He didn't know anything more than I did at that point, and I believed him. Whatever this was, it clearly hadn't been passed down evenly. Some people in this family had been carrying it for 50 years. Others, like Ben, like me until 3 weeks ago, had no idea there was anything to carry at all. And upstairs, at the end of the hall past the bathroom, there's the blue room. I didn't go straight for it in case you're picturing some horror movie version of me creeping toward the door with a flashlight my first night there. I actually avoided it for almost 2 weeks. I unpacked my kitchen stuff. I figured out which light switches did what. I found a repair guy for the garage door, normal moving in stuff, but I'd walk past that door every single day and every single time I'd notice something new about it. It's not just one lock. There's a modern deadbolt, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store, clearly added sometime in the last 20 years. But underneath it, older, is a second lock, ornate and slightly rusted, the kind that takes a long skeleton key instead of a regular one. 2 locks on a door in a house where every other door, including the front door, has exactly one. I found the old key by accident. I was going through Margaret's jewelry box looking for anything worth keeping or giving to my mother, and underneath a velvet tray of costume earrings there was a small brass key, long and thin, tied with a faded ribbon to a torn scrap of paper that just said Blue RM in her handwriting. I held onto it for a long time that night. I didn't use it. I want to be clear about that because later people acted like I broke into that room the second I had the means, and that's not what happened. I sat on the edge of my bed with a 50-year-old key in my hand, and I thought about the fact that my grandmother, who forgot very little and did almost nothing by accident, had hidden this key somewhere I would eventually find it, while also writing a legal document telling me not to use it. Those 2 things don't line up unless she wanted me to notice the contradiction. I called my mother the next day and asked her, as casually as I could manage, what was in the blue room. There was a pause on the line that told me everything before she said a word. Your grandmother had her reasons, she said. That's it, that's the whole answer. When I pushed, asked why it needed 2 locks, why it was even called the blue room specifically like it was a name and not just a description, she got quiet in that clipped way she gets when she wants a conversation to be over. It's not something we talk about, Evelyn. Please just leave it alone. For me. For her, not for Grandma's memory, not because it was dangerous, not because it was private. For her. Richard was less careful. He came by about 4 days later, ostensibly to check on the property, which really meant to look around and make sure I hadn't sold anything or changed the locks. We stood in the kitchen, which still smelled like Margaret's hand soap, and he brought up the room himself, which surprised me. You haven't been up there, have you? He said, not really a question. I told him no, but I asked what was up there. Nothing you need to know about, he said. Then when I didn't let it go. There's nothing in that room that's going to make your life better, Evelyn, I'm serious. If you open that door, you're going to regret it. What's inside? I asked him directly. He looked at me for a second like he was deciding how much to say, and then he said, something that should have stayed buried, and picked his keys back up off the counter like that settled it. I want to say that I found that terrifying, but honestly what I felt was something closer to insulted. My whole family had decided, apparently without me, that I wasn't someone who got to know things about my own family. About a room in a house that was legally mine. I'm not proud of how much that got under my skin, but it did, and I think that's a pretty human reaction, not some reckless main character thing. For a while I actually tried to talk myself out of caring. I told myself Margaret was a private person, maybe it was medical stuff, maybe it was something embarrassing about money, maybe it was nothing at all, and the will was just an old woman being weird about her stuff, the way old women sometimes are. I genuinely tried the boring explanations first. Old people hoard things they're ashamed of sometimes. I told myself maybe it was as simple as unpaid debts, or a stash of love letters from an affair, or some medical equipment she didn't want anyone seeing because it made her death feel too close while she was still alive. I ran through every mundane possibility I could think of, mostly because the alternative, that my grandmother had built an entire legal mechanism around keeping a secret from me specifically, was more unsettling than I wanted to admit. I didn't touch the room. I kept unpacking. I got back to freelance work, because bills don't pause for family mysteries. I also, if I'm honest, Spent a fair amount of that first week hoping the whole thing would just fade into background noise the way most unresolved family weirdness does. Every family has one, right? An uncle nobody mentions at Christmas, a photo that's mysteriously missing from every album, a divorce nobody explains the real reason for. I told myself the Blue Room might just be our family's version of that, something everyone silently agreed to stop asking about 2 generations ago, not because it was dangerous, but because asking was more trouble than it was worth. I might have believed that, too, if my mother hadn't sounded so afraid on the phone, and if Richard hadn't looked so much like a man bracing for impact every time the room came up. Then I found the photographs. I was going through a box in the attic labelled 1978-1980, Margaret's labelling, not mine, looking for pictures for the memorial slideshow my mother wanted for the 1-year anniversary, because apparently we're doing that. Most of it was what you'd expect. Margaret younger, my mother as a kid, a couple pictures of a car nobody owns anymore. And then there was one photo, slightly overexposed, of Margaret standing in front of what I now recognise as the garden gate at the house, and next to her, holding her hand, is a little girl. Maybe 5 years old, dark hair in 2 braids, a dress with a collar, squinting into the sun. I don't have kids and I'm not a mother, so I want to be careful about how I say this, but the second I saw that photo I had this strange, specific feeling, almost physical, like recognising your own face in a mirror you didn't expect. The little girl looked like me, not vaguely. Specifically, the shape of the eyebrows, the gap between the front teeth, even the way she was standing with one foot turned slightly inward. I flipped the photo over out of habit, and on the back, in Margaret's handwriting, it said, June 14, 1979. I don't have any cousins that age. Richard's only child, my cousin Ben, wasn't born until the mid-90s. I'm the only grandchild on that side. So who was this kid, 30-something years before I was born, who looked enough like me that I did a double take at a photograph? I brought it downstairs and called my mother, and I could hear immediately that I'd made a mistake even asking. Her voice changed, not upset like grief, upset like caught. Where did you find that? She said, which is not the response you give to a stranger in an old photo. In a box in the attic. Mom, who is this? Put the photograph back, Evelyn. I'm not going to put it back until you tell me who she is. It doesn't matter who she is, it was a long time ago. Her voice cracked slightly on long time. Please, just leave it, put it back where you found it. She hung up before I could ask again. My mother does not hang up on me. In 29 years I could count the number of times she's done that on one hand, and every single time it's because something scared her more than she wanted me to see. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, and started doing what I probably should have started doing the day of the will reading, which was actually researching my own family, instead of just absorbing everyone's discomfort about it. I found the town's local historical society had digitized old church and civic records going back decades, baptisms, marriages, the occasional obituary. I searched Hart. Margaret Hart, married 1966. Richard Hart, born 1969, baptized that same year at St. Bartholomew's. Straightforward, expected. Then, almost by accident, scrolling through a scanned parish register from 1974, I found a second entry. A baptism. Name, Anna Hart. Parents listed, Margaret Hart and her husband, my grandfather, who died before I was born. Born 1974, which would make her 5 years old in a photograph dated June 1979. Margaret Hart had 2 children, not 1. I sat with that for a long time. I went looking for Anna Hart in every record after that, school registries, later parish records, anything, and she just stops. There's a baptism in 1974 and then nothing. No confirmation record, no marriage, no obituary, thank God. I checked that first out of some instinct I didn't examine too closely at the time. She simply disappears from the paper trail sometime around the age the girl in the photograph looked to be. Like someone reached into the family's history and pulled a thread out cleanly enough that most people wouldn't notice the fabric had changed. I didn't sleep that night. Around 4 in the morning I went upstairs, stood in front of the Blue Room with the little brass key in my hand, and told myself I was only going to open the modern lock, just to see, just to look, not to go all the way in. I want to be honest that this is a lie people tell themselves right before they do the thing anyway. I turned the modern deadbolt. It clicked easily, recently oiled, which told me somebody, probably Margaret, near the end, had been in and out of this room more recently than a will condition would suggest for something meant to stay untouched forever. The old lock underneath took longer. The key stuck, I had to wiggle it, and for a second I thought it wasn't going to turn at all. Then it gave, with a sound like something exhaling, and the door swung open into a room that had clearly not been touched in years, but had also clearly not always been meant to be forgotten. It was a child's room. Small bed stripped down to a bare, yellowed mattress. A wooden dresser with a chipped drawer pull. Faded wallpaper, blue obviously, with a pattern of little birds that had probably been charming in 1974 and now just looked tired. There were drawings taped to one wall, curling at the corners, crayon suns and stick figure families, and a cat that was clearly meant to be affectionate given how many legs it had. There was a small wooden box on the dresser, and dozens of letters tied together with string in a drawer I later found, and a shoebox of toys, and clothes still folded in the closet in a size meant for a 5 or 6-year-old. I found one drawing signed at the bottom, in the shaky, uneven print of a young kid learning her letters. Anna. This was her room. A room for a daughter my grandmother had that my mother wouldn't name, that my uncle called something that should have stayed buried. Sealed shut for what looked like almost 50 years, with fresh oil on the newer lock, meaning someone, I'm almost certain it was Margaret herself, had been coming in here alone, right up until she got too sick to climb the stairs. I didn't touch much that first night. I sat on the floor for a while looking at the drawings, and then I locked the room back up, both locks, and went to bed, and lay there feeling like the house had just gotten bigger and colder at the same time. Over the next couple weeks I went back into that room a lot, slowly, respectfully. The way you'd go through anyone's private things after they died, even though technically I wasn't supposed to be in there at all. The wooden box on the dresser had ribbons in it, a baby tooth in a twist of tissue paper, and a lock of dark hair tied with thread. The letters in the drawer were the real find. Most of them were written by Margaret and never sent, drafts or copies she kept for herself, addressed to someone named Elena. Some were older, clearly from the early 70s, and some were much newer, dated within the last 10 years, which told me this wasn't a closed chapter Margaret had simply locked away and left. She had been actively, privately, corresponding or trying to about this for most of her life. The early letters were vague in that way people are vague when they're writing around something too painful to name directly, but a pattern started to form. Margaret referred to the arrangement, and what we agreed, and more than once, to protecting the children, both of them. One letter, dated 1979, the same year as the photograph, said something close to, "I know what I told people, I know it wasn't the truth." But the truth would have destroyed more than it saved, and I decided long ago that I would rather carry a lie than watch this family come apart because of what he did. She didn't say who he was, not in that letter anyway. It became pretty clear, reading between the lines of a dozen unsent letters, that at some point when Anna was around 5, she stopped living with the family. Margaret had, in her words in one letter, given her a different life, one without our name attached to it, and had spent decades afterward quietly checking on her from a distance without ever fully explaining why she'd done it or fully reconnecting. I called my mother again, gentler this time, and told her what I'd found. She didn't hang up, but she also didn't say much. I was 5 when it happened, Evelyn. I don't remember most of it. I just remember one day there was a sister and then there wasn't, and nobody in this family has ever once talked about it out loud, not to me, not to Richard, not to each other as far as I know. You don't grow up asking questions about the thing your whole family has agreed not to ask questions about. You just learn not to. That, more than anything, is what made me keep going. Not some dramatic thirst for a secret, but the simple, sad fact that my mother had grown up next to an absence nobody would name, and had spent 50 years assuming that was just how families worked. Finding Anna took about 3 weeks of the kind of quiet, boring research nobody puts in movies, old adoption and name change records, a genealogy forum where someone had transcribed county filings, a marriage record for a woman whose maiden name didn't match anything but whose birth date lined up exactly with the baptism record I'd already found. There were a lot of dead ends before that. I spent one entire weekend convinced I'd found her in a different county 3 hours in the wrong direction, only to realize the birth year was off by a decade, because I'd misread a scan of a filing so faded it might as well have been written in pencil underwater. I emailed a records office twice, and got the kind of polite, useless non-answer that government offices specialize in. I even, at one particularly low point, considered just asking Richard directly whether Anna was still alive, before deciding I didn't trust him yet to give me a straight answer, and would rather spend another 2 weeks doing it myself than take his word for anything. Somewhere along the way, whoever had taken her in, and it wasn't clear to me yet who that was, had given her a new surname. She'd grown up as Anna Mercer. She was, according to public records, 49 years old, living about 3 hours away, and as far as I could tell from a very cautious amount of internet stalking alive, employed as some kind of school administrator, and entirely unaware, possibly, that a grandniece she'd never met had just spent a month reading her childhood letters. I wrote to her instead of calling. It felt like the kind of thing that deserved a letter and not a cold phone call from a stranger claiming to be family. I told her who I was, that Margaret had recently passed, that I'd found her room, and that I wasn't trying to ambush her with anything. I just wanted to understand what had happened if she was willing to talk. I almost didn't send it. I sat with that envelope for 2 days. She wrote back within a week and said she'd meet me, but only in person and only once, because I've had enough of this family reaching out and disappearing again. We met at a diner halfway between our 2 towns, which felt appropriately anticlimactic for something I'd been building up in my head for a month. She looked like an older version of the girl in the photograph in a way that made my chest tighten a little when she walked in. Same dark hair, grey now, same set to her jaw. She ordered coffee and didn't touch it for the first 20 minutes we talked. The first thing she told me before I'd even really asked anything was, "Your grandmother wasn't my mother." I remember actually laughing a little, not because it was funny, but because it was so far from what I expected that my brain didn't know what else to do with it. I told her I'd found the baptism record with Margaret's name on it. She said the record was accurate as far as it went. Margaret had raised her for the first 5 years of her life, had been listed as her mother on paper for reasons that were about protecting people, not about biology, but that Margaret had not given birth to her. Then who was, I asked. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You really shouldn't have opened that room," which wasn't an answer, but it also wasn't a no. She didn't tell me everything that day. She was careful, guarded, the way you'd expect from someone who'd spent 44 years being erased from a family's official story. But she gave me enough. She told me that Margaret had a younger sister, Elena, who I hadn't found any trace of in my research because Elena had died young before I was ever looking for her, and that Elena was her biological mother. Elena had died. Anna wasn't entirely sure of the details. She'd been told different versions over the years, not long after Anna was born, and Margaret had taken her in. She also told me a few smaller things that day that I didn't fully understand the weight of until later. That she remembered the blue room, actually remembered it, in fragments, the bird wallpaper, a specific creak in the 3rd stair, a woman she now assumed was Margaret reading to her at night in a voice she still sometimes heard in dreams. That she remembered being told, very suddenly, that she was going to go live somewhere else, and being too young to understand it wasn't temporary. That for years afterward, she used to write letters to Aunt Margaret that she was never sure got mailed, because her adoptive parents were kind but firm that this was not something the family discussed. She said she stopped writing them around age 12, once she'd made peace or something close to it, with the fact that nobody was going to write back. "I used to think I made her up," she told me at one point, stirring her coffee she still hadn't drunk. "The lady in the blue room, my parents, the ones who raised me, they were good people, but they never wanted to talk about before. So for a long time I genuinely didn't know if I was remembering a real person or just some story I told myself as a kid to explain why I felt like I didn't fully belong anywhere." "Why didn't Margaret just say that then?" I asked. "Why lie about being your mother at all if she was doing something as generous as raising her sister's kid?" Anna's jaw tightened, because it wasn't generous, not entirely. There was more to it than a woman losing her sister and taking in an orphan. That's the story I got fed for years too before I found out it wasn't the whole thing. If you want the rest, you're going to have to ask your uncle. He knows. He's always known. I'm done being the one who has to explain your family to you. That stuck with me for days. I hadn't told her Richard's name, or that I even had an uncle by that name. She knew, which meant her memory of this family or someone's contact with her over the years went further than a 5-year-old's fading recollection of a house she left decades ago. I confronted Richard about 2 weeks after that, in the kitchen again, because apparently that kitchen is where every uncomfortable conversation in this family happens. I told him I'd met Anna. I watched something in his face fall, not with surprise, but with the specific tiredness of a person who'd been waiting for a conversation they always knew was coming. "She's not who you think she was," I told him. "And apparently Margaret wasn't her mother. Elena was, and apparently you already knew that." He sat down at the table without being asked, which he'd never done in my house before that day. "I knew," he said. "I've known since I was about your age." Before he told me the rest, He asked if he could get a glass of water first, which felt like such a strange, human, small thing to need in the middle of a conversation like that. But I got it for him anyway and waited, while he drank about half of it just staring at the table. I remember thinking, watching him, that this was probably the first time in decades he'd said any of this out loud to anyone, and that whatever came next was going to cost him something to say regardless of how it landed with me. I asked him why nobody ever told me, told my mother, told anyone, why this had been sealed up in a room for 50 years like it was radioactive. He was quiet for a bit, and when he talked again his voice had lost the edge it always had whenever the room came up before. Our father, he said, my grandfather, a man I never met who died before I was born, did something. Financially, back in the 70s. There was a business a family mum and dad knew, and dad, he mismanaged funds that weren't his to mismanage. Not a small mistake, it ruined that family. Cost them everything, their house, their business, one of their kids had to drop out of university. It was fraud, Evelyn, plainly. Mum found out after the fact. She didn't do it, but she covered for him. Because if it had come out, it wasn't just dad going to prison. It was us, me, our name, everything she'd built. What does that have to do with Anna? Elena was married to the man dad defrauded. That's who Anna's father was before he left, before things fell apart entirely for that family. Elena died, genuinely, an accident, nothing sinister. I want to be clear about that, not long after. And there was no one left in a position to take Anna in that wasn't already tangled up in what our father had done. Mum took her because she felt she owed it, because guilt does strange things to people, and I think some part of her genuinely loved her. But she also knew that if anyone connected the dots, Elena's daughter, raised by the family that ruined Elena's husband, it would eventually surface what Dad had done. So she gave Anna a new name, a new family further away, and she spent the rest of her life half in contact with her and half hiding from her at the same time. That room isn't cursed, Evelyn, it's guilt, 50 years of it in one house behind one door. I asked him finally why he wanted the house so badly if that was true. If it wasn't about money, what was it about? Because I've spent my whole life managing what's in that room, he said. Keeping it quiet, keeping Mum's secret. I thought if I had the house I could just let it sit there and eventually let the whole thing rot away with nobody the wiser. I wasn't trying to hurt you by wanting it, Evelyn. I was trying to finish the job Mum started. I asked him why then Margaret hadn't just left the house to him, if that's what he would have done with it, and quietly buried this the way he wanted. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding how honest to actually be, and then he said, because she was tired of it. Right at the end, she told me not everything, but enough that she'd spent her whole life believing that keeping secrets was the same thing as protecting people, and that she wasn't sure anymore it had ever been true. She said she needed someone in this family who hadn't already made peace with the lie. Someone who'd actually go looking. You were the only person left who fit. Why me? I asked him, because it still didn't make sense, not really, not enough. Because you're the only person in this family she trusted not to bury it again. I found the last letter about a week after that, and I want to say I found it through some clever bit of detective work, but honestly it was luck. I was down in the basement checking on a water stain the repair guy had flagged, and I noticed one of the old floorboards near the far wall was slightly raised, not warped, deliberately raised, like it had been lifted and set back down enough times to lose its fit. Underneath it was a single envelope, my name on the front in Margaret's handwriting, sealed, clearly placed there in the last year or so of her life given how clean the paper still was. I'm not going to type out the whole thing because some of it is mine to keep, but the part that matters, the part I've read probably 30 times since, said this. I spent my entire life believing that keeping secrets was the same thing as protecting people. I told myself that every year I didn't speak of Elena, of Anna, of what your grandfather did, I was holding this family together. I understand now that a secret doesn't protect a family. It only protects whoever caused the damage in the first place. Everyone else just learns to live smaller around the hole where the truth should be. I couldn't undo what I did, Evelyn, and I won't ask you to forgive me for it. But I could make sure it didn't stay buried with me. I chose you because you were the only one who never learned how to leave a question alone. Don't waste that. I sat on that basement floor for a long time after reading it. Before any of that, though, there was a stretch of a few days where I honestly didn't know what to do with what I knew. I remember sitting in the blue room, actually sitting on the floor with my back against the stripped bed frame, holding that basement letter, and feeling less like I'd solved something, and more like I'd just been handed a second job nobody asked if I wanted. It's one thing to want the truth when it's abstract, when it's a locked door and a rumor. It's another thing to actually have it, fully formed, sitting in your hands, and realize that now you're the one who has to decide what happens to it. I thought about just letting it go quiet again, packing the letters back into their drawer, locking both locks, selling the house with the room's contents intact and untouched, the way Margaret's will had technically demanded I never do anything with them at all. Nobody would have known. Richard certainly wouldn't have complained. For about 2 days that actually felt like the responsible option, the kind stewardship of someone else's 50-year-old grief. What changed my mind in the end wasn't some grand realization. It was rereading Margaret's last letter for probably the 10th time and noticing a line I'd skimmed past before. Don't waste that. Not don't tell anyone. Not protect this the way I did. Just don't waste it. She'd spent 5 decades being the only person carrying the weight of what happened, and I don't think she wanted me to simply switch places with her and carry it alone too. I think she wanted the weight actually put down somewhere, distributed among the people it belonged to, even if that meant some uncomfortable conversations in a kitchen that had already hosted more of them than any kitchen should. In the weeks after, I did what I think Margaret actually wanted, which wasn't to blow the family up on principle, but to finally let the people involved talk to each other like the truth existed. I sat down with my mother and told her everything slowly, over 2 different visits, because it was a lot for her to absorb about a sister she barely remembered losing. She cried more than I expected, not for Alina exactly, who she barely knew, but for the version of her own childhood she now had to look at differently, a childhood with a 5-year-old absence in it that everyone had just quietly stepped around for decades. I went back to Anna, this time with the letter and with the rest of what Richard had told me, and I watched something in her ease slightly, not into forgiveness exactly, but into having a fuller picture than the fragmented, second-hand version she'd been carrying around her whole life. She told me she'd always known something didn't add up about the story she was given as a kid, that Margaret had checked on her more than any stranger should, birthday cards with no return address, a scholarship fund that showed up when she was 18 from a source she was never able to trace but always suspected. Knowing the whole shape of it, even the ugly parts, seemed to loosen something in her that had been tight for a very long time. Richard and I never became close exactly, but something between us settled after that conversation in the kitchen. He apologized once in a way that clearly cost him something, for how he'd treated me over the house. I don't think he's a bad person. I think he's a person who was handed a secret at an age too young to know what to do with it, and did the only thing he knew how to do, which was protect it the same way it had been protected around him. There was one more conversation worth mentioning before I get to the end of this, because a few people in the comments last time I posted something like this asked whether my mother ever confronted Richard directly, sibling to sibling, about all of it. She did eventually, about 2 months after I first told her everything. I wasn't in the room for that one, some things aren't mine to narrate, but she told me afterward that it wasn't a screaming match or a reconciliation either, just 2 adults in their 50s finally saying a name out loud to each other that they'd both spent their whole childhoods pretending not to notice was missing. She said Richard cried, which she told me she'd never once seen him do, not even at Margaret's funeral. She said it didn't fix everything between them, that there's still some resentment there about who got told what and when, but that it felt, in her words, like finally being allowed to remember my own childhood, instead of just the version everyone agreed to. I ended up selling the house about 8 months later. Not out of anger, and not because I wanted to get rid of it, I actually loved that house by the end, more than I expected to, but because it was too much house for one person, and because keeping it started to feel less like honouring Margaret and more like just replacing one kind of custody over the secret with another. Before it sold, I emptied the blue room myself, every drawer, every box slowly, over a couple of weekends. Most of it I kept in boxes of my own now in my apartment. I gave the letters to my mother eventually when she said she was ready to read them, which took her almost a year. The one thing I kept for myself out of everything in that room is the drawing signed Anna in that shaky 5-year-old print. I had it framed and I gave it to her the next time we met, which by then had become something closer to regular, not quite family dinners, but coffee every couple of months, a relationship still figuring out what shape it was allowed to be. She cried when I gave it to her, more than she had at anything else in this whole mess, and she told me it was the first thing from that part of her life that anyone had ever handed back to her instead of taken away. The last time I saw the house, the day I handed over the keys to the new owners, a young couple expecting their first kid, I asked if I could walk through it one more time on my own before signing anything. They were kind about it, waited outside by their car while I went room to room. The kitchen still smelled faintly like Margaret's hand soap even after all the cleaning and staging, or maybe I just imagined it did because I wanted it to. The blue room was empty by then, wallpaper still up because the buyers said they liked the bones of it and planned to redo it themselves eventually. But every drawing, every letter, every box was long gone, packed into my own closets 3 hours away. Standing in that empty room without any of its contents in it felt strange in a way I hadn't expected, less haunted than I thought it would, honestly. Mostly it just felt like a room. Small, a little sun-faded 4 walls that had held onto something important for a very long time, and could finally just be a room again. For whoever came next, with no obligation to keep anyone's secret. I think about that room a lot, even though it's not mine anymore, even though someone else's family probably uses it as a guest room or an office now with no idea what it used to hold. For a long time I thought the story of my grandmother's will was about what was locked inside that room, the letters, the drawings, the small wooden box with a baby tooth in it. But I don't think that's actually what it was about, not really. I think it was about who a family decides is allowed to know the truth, and for how long, and at what cost to the people who never got a vote in the matter. Margaret spent 50 years believing silence was a kind of love. Maybe it started out that way. But somewhere in that room, behind 2 locks in 50 years of unsent letters, it stopped being love and became something closer to a debt nobody was paying down. I'd like to think that by finally opening that door, I didn't just find out what happened to Anna. I finally closed it out for good on Margaret's behalf, in the only way that was ever actually going to work, not by keeping the door locked, but by walking all the way through it. Edit, a lot of people are asking if Richard and I are okay now. We're civil, we talk, we're not exactly close but we're honest with each other, which is more than we had before. And a few people asked about my mother. She and Anna have met twice now. It's slow, it's awkward, but it's real, and I think that's more than any of us had a year ago. Edit 2, to the people asking why Margaret didn't just tell me herself while she was alive instead of doing this whole locked room, hidden letter thing. I've asked myself that too. The best answer I have is that some people spend so long protecting a secret that they lose the ability to just say it out loud, even at the end. The room was the only language she had left for it.